Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. And Ebony, thank you for the introduction. I want to thank you and Dr. Welton and future Dr. Owens for making the arrangements to get me here and for inviting me to speak. One of the things that isn't in my bio is that I was recently promoted to full professor. And one of the, thanks. But one of the things that I promised myself I would do once that hurdle was over would be to spend a more significant amount of my research efforts focusing on Black women. So it had been an interest of mine since graduate school. But as things turned out, my dissertation, which was supposed to be about Black women in college, was actually about cultural centers. And I'm not regretful about that decision, but I've had several years to reflect on what were some of the structures and what were some of the messages I received that diminished my initial excitement about pursuing that research topic. And so rather than do a presentation where I spend a lot of time reviewing research studies that I've done, even though a little bit of that is in this presentation, I sort of envision this presentation as one where you all would join me in sort of envisioning my thought processes around Black women, how we're positioned, and the many wonderful things that come from Black women that are often unrecognized and treated as invisible, yet hold the promise for a lot of the issues that we see in society and within higher education. So that's sort of the framework for my thinking. Before I go deeper into the PowerPoint, I want to begin with a clip of Kimberly Crenshaw's most recent TED Talk. And I just want to show a brief snippet of that to help frame the rest of the presentation. Okay, so I wanted to begin with that clip because I think her talk on intersectionality is actually what helped me to frame my talk for today. And I think in addition to helping us to using intersectionality to understand the issues and challenges that Black women face, it also helps us to understand why we don't recognize their contributions. So it's not just about the fact that we don't see the violence or how they're victimized through state violence, but also that their contributions overwhelmingly go unnoticed. And I think if we're, in terms of looking at the academy, I think in Bell Hook's work, she offers a prime example of what this looks like. So she talks about how whenever she asks her students to name Black intellectuals, and she doesn't assign, doesn't tell them to be specific about gender, they always immediately begin with Du Bois, Delaney, Garvey, Malcolm X, and then they may mention contemporary folks such as Cornel West and Henry Louis Gates. But then when she requests that they be gender specific, they begin to become hesitant and have struggles with naming women. And so it doesn't occur to them to mention Angela Davis or Alice Walker or Toni Morrison or Mary Church Terrell or Ida B. Wells. Like, these names never occur to her students. And what she says is that sexist subordination in Black intellectual life continues to obscure and devalue the work of Black female intellectuals, and this is why it's so difficult for students to name us. So if we think about the framing and considering the roles for Black women in terms of transforming society broadly and education specifically, we have to consider the frames that we have readily at our disposal and the problematic nature of those frames. So I've identified 5 frames that have been written about by plenty of Black feminist scholars, Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Melissa HarrisPerry talks about it in Sister Citizen. And so, there is the mammy stereotype or controlling image of the woman who puts others before herself, or she's committed to caring for other people's children before her own, and has this uncanny ability to make us comfortable, and she's soothing, and she makes everyone feel better. So she's this ultimate image of selflessness. And oftentimes she's portrayed as heavy or unattractive or dark-skinned. There is the sapphire who's sassy and angry. She has a smart mouth. She's disrespectful and at times can use her body or will use her body to get what she wants. There's the superwoman who is, superhuman, can do anything. Her goal is getting the job done despite the psychological, physical, and emotional risk. And the presumption is that she doesn't need a man per se. She perseveres and constantly moves and overcomes life's obstacles. A more recent trope is the idea of Black women as a new model minority. And it points to this exceptionalism about Black women and through them, because, for example, they graduate at a higher rate or attend college at a higher rate than their male counterparts, then there's something that people should be looking to for them, or that if other groups look at what Black women have overcome, then they'll be okay. And so it relies on this sort of bootstrap mentality. And then if you think about this model minority myth and how it plays out for undergraduate women, Rosales and Person talk about this myth that Black women have achieved higher educational levels, and due to their attainment over the past 20 years, it might contribute to the lack of attention from institutional leaders. And then the last one is about Black girl magic, which originally was intended as a way to uplift Black women and their accomplishment, but it unintentionally suggests Black women are miraculous somehow. Or it's closely linked to this whole idea of Black women being superhuman or somehow unreal. And in the book that Ebony mentioned, the edited volume I just wrote, or edited with Natasha Kroom at Clemson University, in our introduction, we note that while the purpose of Black Girl Magic messages across black women's communities is rooted in self-empowerment and uplift, the message has also been mishandled and used as a trope to diminish the complexity of its meaning for Black women, who are almost always forced to define and redefine themselves beyond stereotypical notions of resilience and success. And so when we think about these ideas, none of these tropes present this holistic viewpoint of Black women's lives, but when they're used, they're treated as if they capture the totality of Black womanhood. And in this regard, Black women become mired in a liminal status that prevents, or at least attempts to prevent, Black women from being, living, and experiencing their true selves. And that's not to say that these images are untrue in some that they're true or wholly false, but the issue is that each relies on this incomplete idea. And so Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie talks about the danger of a single story, and my argument is that these tropes do promote a single story. And what she says is the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they're incomplete and they make one story become the only story. But she further contends that stories matter, and while they've been used to dispossess and malign, they can also be used to empower and to humanize and to repair the broken dignity that some stories have crushed. And so my goal here today is just that. So in the spirit of Valentine's Day, I want to show Black women some love. And my desire to do so is not simply because I identify as a Black woman, but more importantly because I am and am always committed to using whatever platform I have to illuminate the experiences of marginalized populations, or those who are typically forgotten in society. And so my underlying thinking are questions related to who exercises the power to silence Black women, and in what ways do they exercise this power? And I also want us to consider who benefits when Black women remain hyper-visible yet unmarked in society. And my second goal is to situate Black women's often unnamed contributions as a framework for institutional leaders who certainly espouse a commitment to transformation and change, but likely haven't considered Black women as a model for what the enactment of transformation might look like. And in all honesty, my premise is not too far-fetched. So in the introduction of Sister Citizen, Melissa HarrisPerry's book, she offers a similar idea, and she says, the struggle of recognition is the nexus of human identity and national identity, where much of the important work of politics occurs. African American women fully embody this struggle. By studying the lives of Black women, we gain important insight into how citizens yearn for and work toward recognition. And she later shares, it is the African American women surviving at the nexus of racialized, gendered, and class disprivilege who mark the progress of the nation. So if we're to consider Black women's work, it's important to define exactly what it is and what warrants Black work, and so Black women's work. And so I want to borrow from Patricia Hill Collins' work on Black feminist thought. And she, and I agree with her, argues that there's much to be learned when we center Black women's epistemologies. So when writing about Black women's work, Hill Collins and several other Black women scholars often refer to Zora Neale Hurston's book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And they quote from the main character, Janie, who explains the load that Black women are expected to bear and that Black women are basically the mule of the world, right? And so this notion of being a mule carries with it both a symbolic and a literal connotation. And symbolically, Black women's work is burdened with the heavy load that, sits at the intersections of racism, sexism, classism, and numerous other forms of oppression. Now, Janie's use of the mule metaphor points to a seeming dehumanization of women, where their work is primarily about serving others, never being recognized for their contributions, and the overall expectation that they engage in this work without complaint. And Black women's work extends beyond paid labor, so it's also characterized by the unpaid labor in their homes, and sometimes the homes of others, and the labor required toward the continued uplift of Black people. And Black women's work is oftentimes thankless in terms of labor, and their work primarily is just about the doing. And so whether a Black woman is working at a Fortune 500 company, or working in the service industry, or as a domestic laborer, they still hold so much value and promise for what the world and what our institutions might be if we took the time and energy to center their voices. And I often believe that it is Black women's work that operates as this double-edged sword. So on the one hand, I'd argue that our work changes lives, minds, and mindsets, whether it's acknowledged or not. But this same work has been used against Black women as a backdrop to ensure they are seen through a narrow frame in which their only value is as workers or valued only for their labor. And so this intense labor embedded in Black women's work is what gives weight to the strong Black woman archetype that I mentioned. And HarrisPerry references this, trope as part of a shame management strategy, where Black women, if we were to examine their plight and force society to take a look in the mirror, the disenfranchisement of Black women is perhaps the most difficult thing this country and society has to grapple with. But instead of doing so, we celebrate Black women by calling them strong as if to compliment them, all the while knowing that the ultimate goal is to comfort us and to help manage the shame. And so such contradictions are not just limited to strength and shame. And so I want to give 3 examples of these contradictions. The first is Oprah Winfrey, who everybody in this room knows who Oprah is, correct? Okay. So she's a billionaire, and she's been, very transparent about the victimization and abuse she faced as a young girl, and the experience of growing up poor and the numerous challenges she's faced, and how she rose above all of that. And the wonderful thing about her is that she demonstrates this art of turning lemons into lemonade, right? So when given opportunities, she sees them. And if we think about her show, she literally changed daytime television. And there's probably no place on earth where people don't know who Oprah is. But there is this precarious thing about her, and that in the same breath, she's often mammified and expected to be everyone's counselor and mother. And the primary demographic of her following is white middle-aged women who no doubt love her, but still require her to care for them. And so, speaking of lemonade, let's talk about Beyonce. So she, of course, is overwhelmingly successful and is an entity in and of herself. In some ways, I feel like she's deified. And people love her. If you think about the recent announcement that she was pregnant with twins, it basically broke the internet. Like, it was the cure-all for the challenges people were, feeling related to President Trump. And so things changed when she began to protest through her music, and there's a physicality about Beyonce. So when people think about her or hear her or see her, images of her body will surface. And so when she began to use, her music as a platform, and she did the performance at the Super Bowl, she began to be chastised. So one news reporter referenced her as vulgar, and of course there were many comments on Twitter at the time. And some will argue that her stance in her music contributed to the loss of the recent Grammy. But I believe the loss is not just about her stance, though that's likely part of it. The loss is more about a reward system that was never intended to recognize her loss and recognize her music in the first place, especially not the music on the Lemonade album. And so the system does reward and celebrate her body, but not her mind. In the third example with Serena Williams, she is the greatest athlete of all time. Not the greatest woman athlete, but the greatest athlete of all time. But she's not allowed to be. So in her world, she's dehumanized at every turn because the world refuses to hear her because she doesn't conform to Eurocentric standards of beauty. And so her humanity is often reduced to that of an animal, a stallion to be exact. And this sort of conjures up this whole idea of women being mules, so this animal, this dehumanizing of women. And so with these 3 examples, I've offered Black women whose contributions and work are really nothing short of amazing, but whose lives demonstrate the contradictory nature in which Black women are marginalized and devalued despite what they've extended to the world. And they aren't the only ones. And so one of the challenges that I've sort of outlined is the inherent contradictions associated with Black women's work. I think the other big challenge deals with this notion of silence, and more specifically efforts to overtly silence Black women and the insidious acts of silencing that occur. So let's consider Ella Baker, who was central to the civil rights movement. And one of her greatest contributions was establishing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was an NAACP field secretary and ran several of their branches. She helped organize the SCLC, ran voter registration campaigns. However, she's never offered as the face of the civil rights movement and barely ever mentioned. So the face of the movement is Martin Luther King, right? And so there's a silencing there of her contributions. If we think about Claudette Colvin, Racy Taylor, and Rosa Parks. So Claudette was 15 years old when she refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery. And she's quoted as saying in a Newsweek article, "It's my constitutional right to sit here as much as that lady. I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right." And she says, "I felt like Sojourner Truth was pushing me down on one shoulder and Harriet Tubman was pushing me down on the other, saying, 'Sit down, girl.' I was glued to my seat." However, Colvin's story couldn't be used to build a case against segregation because of her young age, and she was unmarried and had become pregnant. And so, in other words, her image didn't meet respectability politics. And it was feared she would be negatively perceived by the court of public opinion. So much of the credit goes to Rosa Parks, who was, of course, heavily involved in the movement and most known for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. Now, the interesting thing about Rosa Parks is that she's characterized as this meek and mild seamstress who was just tired and didn't want to give up her seat. However, she was central to the civil rights movement. She was an activist and, of course, heavily involved in the NAACP. And she was charged with investigating sexual violence targeted toward Black women. And it's only recent that the sexual violence that Black women faced or endured has even entered the dialogue. And it entered through the case of Racy Taylor, who Rosa Parks was investigating. And Taylor had been kidnapped in 1944 and raped by 6 white men in Alabama, who ultimately admitted that they raped her, but were never found guilty. And she wasn't alone. There were several other women. Betty Jean Owens, Rosalie Ingram, and Joan Little were all subjected to sexualized violence, harassment, indignities, and intimidation, or what has been termed ritualistic rape, by white men that often went accounted for and resulted in very little redress. So Joan Little's case is particularly important because she killed her white male aggressor or would-be rapist, and she later, then she escaped prison, and she later surrendered but was accused of seducing the prison guard and somehow responsible for his attempt to rape her. If we think about Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president and survived several assassination attempts, and she was the first Black U.S. Congresswoman and the first woman to run for president before Hillary. And she had to sue for her participation in the presidential debates at the time. And so here is a system purposefully attempting to silence her to where she has to sue to participate. And then finally, Coretta Scott King, who is, heavily referred to as MLK's widow, and that's recently that I saw that on the news. But she was so much more, and her story is often silenced because of her humanity being relegated to wife and mother. But she was quite outspoken and committed, if not more, to civil rights. And interestingly, she was in the news lately, given Senator Elizabeth Warren's decision to read her letter criticizing Jeff Sessions. And so I think it's interesting that when she submitted that letter in the first place, it was silenced. And then for another person to try to read that letter, for Rule 39 to be enacted to silence her yet again. So it wasn't just the silencing of Elizabeth Warren, but also the re-silencing of Coretta Scott King's voice. And so, I recall looking at the news as they talked about the situation, but they kept referring to her as MLK wife. So she couldn't, it was never her full name. It was her role in relation to him. So the contemporary silencing among Black women intellectuals is also telling. And I think it's important for us to consider what happens when Black women intellectuals take the liberty to insert themselves into dialogues and offer their perspectives. And oftentimes, despite the tremendous value that Black women bring, they're silenced or simply told to shut up. So I've seen this more times than I'd like, but again, want to provide examples for how this looks in a more contemporary context. So let's think about Cornel West's backlash against Melissa HarrisPerry. And so basically, Melissa HarrisPerry publicly disagreed with West's criticism of President Obama. And in an article for The Nation, she stated as saying, in a self-aggrandizing victimology sermon deceptively wrapped in the discourse of prophetic witness, Professor West offers thin criticism of President Obama and stunning insight into the delicate ego of the self-appointed black leadership class that has been largely supplanted in recent years. And so according to a feature article for Diverse Issues in Higher Education, West responded by calling HarrisPerry a liar, a fake, and a fraud. He further suggested that her work was not scholarly enough and added that her recently released book at the time, Sister Citizen, was wild and out of control. So such gripping commentary suggests that regardless of who was right or wrong, West comfortably attacked her personhood and scholarly contributions. And you have to wonder, could it be that HarrisPerry disagrees with much of West's rhetoric because she's allowed to have an opinion? Could it be that she's successfully infringing on the intellectual space that West has proudly occupied for so many years? To be sure, her intellectual prowess may likely be perceived as a threat to West's status as the preeminent black intellectual and to his finances. So rather than seeking ground, the schism between West and HarrisPerry reveals some deeply rooted issues regarding who can and who should speak on behalf of black issues. And Elaine Brown is quoted as saying, she's a former Black Panther Party leader, she shared that when black women speak out, they are presumed to be eroding black manhood, to be hindering the progress of the black race. Yes, thank you, Ebony. Okay. So I want to provide another example of black women's intellectual erasure, which occurred in 2014 when Cynthia Fordham's work on the burden of acting white was mentioned, but her name was overwhelmingly absent from President Obama's town hall meeting on My Brother's Keeper. And in an article titled Race and Beyond, Are Black Female Academics Ignored?, Fordham explains how she reacted when a friend she hadn't heard from in some time contacted her about the president's talk. She says, "I steeled myself for devastating news. Instead, he told me something that is so ordinary in my professional life I might not have noticed without his call. Did you hear President Obama talking about acting white on the CBS morning show this morning?" He shouted into the receiver, "Yeah, girl, the president talked about your research but didn't mention your name." This news evoked a mixture of familiar feelings. First came the elation that no one I loved had died. But that quickly passed, giving way to the humiliation and pain that follows with the awareness that someone once again has appropriated and misrepresented my work. The silencing also has occurred recently in terms of HBCU leadership. So recently in the news, there has been talk about 4 black women presidents either stepping down or being fired from their roles at HBCUs. And there isn't much information about that, but some insinuation that some of these women came in attempting to change things that didn't bode well with primarily male governing boards. And even in the case of Gwendolyn Boyd, it is interesting because as she was being hired, news broke that there was a clause in her contract that she could not have overnight visitors, right? And so these examples demonstrate how black women intellectuals are sometimes forced into intersectional invisibility or an unmarked place in the academy. And so our opinions, scholarship, leadership, etc., become fair game for unwarranted attacks. So I want to shift to begin having us think about why is it that don't people listen, and what becomes the consequences for silencing Black women. And I want to give my own research as an example. There was a recently released issue of the Journal of Negro Education that focused on Black women and girls. And my contribution to that focused on Black undergraduate women when they go missing. And the decision to study this actually came from my interactions in being at Indiana University. And if you're familiar with Bloomington, Indiana, there have been several instances of young white students going missing. And it sort of triggered me and my co-author to think about, wow, have Black undergraduate women gone missing? We've never heard about them. And we don't know their names. We don't even know if this is a thing, if this is an issue. And so we decided to investigate that, and came across literature on the missing white woman syndrome, which is a term that was coined by Gwen Ifill, but it talks about this she talks about this round-the-clock news coverage for white women. So names like Lacey Peterson and Elizabeth Smart, some of the other names are escaping me, Natalie Holloway. These names become fixtures in our minds because the media gives more attention to these women because they have the look. So they're white, they're blonde, they're young, they're attractive. All of these pieces that don't get afforded to Black women when they go missing. And so to frame the study, we looked at Henry Giroux's work on the politics of disposability. And when he talks about disposability, he was referencing what happened with Hurricane Katrina and how the people left behind in New Orleans were basically disposable. And he defines it as entire populations are considered disposable, an unnecessary burden on state coffers, and consigned to fend for themselves. And the issue, as we were doing the work to, examine Black undergraduate women going missing, there really wasn't any framing for that, right? There wasn't a way to go out and look for these women or to learn about these women. So if you type in missing woman or missing college woman, all of the pictures are white. But you might come across a name by reading through the many articles that deal with white women going missing and making some connections between the institutions. And so we challenge this framing, but also talk about the lack of appropriate framing, similar to Kimberly Crenshaw, and how framing is an enforcement of ideological dominance. So there's just nothing that exists right now that says this is how you would go about studying Black women in this context. And we also found a piece by Gross that talked about Black women's lives, and that in order for them to be highlighted in the media or to gain any attention, they have to prove their worthiness. And so that's challenging because the media links their disappearance to crime, mental illness, or somehow suggests that they're responsible for their disappearance. So in the findings, we found 9 women. Overall, there was limited attention. Some of them got local attention from the news, but rarely national. And it was the sensationalized violence that garnered the attention. So a woman had to be brutally murdered and raped, or her body parts needed to be found severed, or something like that, in order for the media and law enforcement to even care. With a lot of the women, the black men were central either to the investigation, the disappearance, or the death of these women, which points to a certain disposability politic between Black men and Black women. And there's differential attention. So women who were single mothers rarely got any kind of attention. But for women who had lighter skin, or if they went to an institution with prestige, there was more information available about them. And then those women who were found alive were subjected to immense scrutiny as if they were selfish or they did this purposefully to hurt their families. So there is, again, this study, I think, points to the silencing and why we don't listen. And part of the reason for why we don't listen to women, Black women collectively, has to do with this disposability. I mean, why would you feel compelled to listen to someone whose, life doesn't hold significance for you, right? And, my argument is that there are consequences when we fail to listen. One, it's true that a college degree won't protect or save Black women, but the bottom line is that for Black women, our lives are at stake, literally and figuratively. So when we don't listen, Black women can die, like literally lose our lives. And that all lives are at stake because we miss opportunities that are readily apparent. So, for example, if we look at the most recent election, 94% of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton. Now imagine what our discourse and conversation might be right now had the rest of society followed in that same pathway, right? And so all of this, reminded me of Anna Julia Cooper's work in A Voice from the South, and she says, only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence, without suing or special patronage, then and there the whole race enters with me. And although in her work she specifically references the Negro race, I would argue for expanding this to the human race. So, at this point, I've outlined the need for framing Black women, making them central, and disrupting the silence. And I am encouraged by the fact that there are everyday Black women like myself and people in this room and women that I interact who extend themselves and do the work in a world that is undeserving and where such acts are rarely reciprocal. And so there are women we either don't know or recognize, yet without them, we might have missed out on an opportunity. And part of that has to do with the fact that Black women often aren't granted a seat at the table. And Shirley Chisholm, I have a quote here that says, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And oftentimes that's what Black women have done. I want to go back. So just to give you a few more examples in terms of this whole notion that some things might not have happened if Black women had not been there. So one of the things I learned in doing, the historical research for this study is that when we think about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and I think this might have been featured on Blackish too, but the idea of this dream came from a Black woman, Prathia Hall, and it was during his speech during the March on Washington that Mahalia Jackson stood in the back and encouraged him to give that speech and to change the trajectory of his talk. And so had that encouragement not been there, we might not have had that great I Have a Dream speech. I think if we consider the work of Black sororities and the communities that they serve, the Black girls that they mentor, and how they serve as a training ground for harnessing the talents and promise that we see in many Black women today, whether they're educators, politicians, or leaders, they oftentimes have a link to Black sororities. I think it's important to think about the Black Lives Matter movement, an ongoing movement that is the brainchild of 3 Black women, queer women, and in visiting their website, they talk about how they, decided to create Black Lives Matter, but how they have been subjected to theft of their work as queer Black women. And Alicia Garza talks about how people would design work based on queer Black women, but then not invite them to participate in it, and ask them to provide materials and ideas for next steps, but wouldn't involve them in it. And so Black women will take a folding chair to the table and then be asked to do the work at the table without any credit involved. Now, if we look across these women, the ones we know well and the ones we don't know so well, I think there are several lessons that could be learned from them. And I just have a few up here, lessons learned where I wish the institutional leaders that I've dealt with would look at Black women and some of the things that they've done and think about how they might channel some of that. It would be really, really awesome. And so when I think about Black women using their voice and not feeling shame for it, I have been playing this clip over and over again of Congresswoman Maxine Waters, because she just is completely fearless. But, you know, she uses her voice and she tells it like it is. I think Black women exude an authenticity that we don't often see. Having the audacity to dream big and to do the work without trying to seek some sort of attention or reward for the work, even when the reward is deserved. Understanding that time is of the essence, so there isn't a lot of sitting around waiting for things and waiting for bureaucracies. Black women work and get things done. This ride or die attitude. So one of the things I've seen lately in social media, as you can tell, I've been doing a lot of social media. It might be because I'm not teaching this semester, but that's okay. Where it's been a joy to see Black men come forth and say, you know, I might not be who I am because of my Black mother or a Black teacher or someone who invested in me. And just being encouraging and inspirational, and Black women who highlight other Black women, okay? And then having this willingness to navigate ever-present tensions. If we think about higher education, our campuses are filled with tensions that we have to deal with, and oftentimes our leaders refuse to deal with those tensions. So I want to give, before I move toward closing, I want to just give one example. And because I study race and racism in higher education, this is sort of what rang true for me if we think about these characteristics in terms of institutional leadership. So racism is a big issue on campus. There's been student activism, lots of issues around that. But racism has been on our campuses since 1636 with Harvard. But most institutional leaders, which happen to be white men, are overwhelmingly aloof when it comes to racial issues or even having the wherewithal to acknowledge that racism exists. In a recent Inside Higher Ed article, a survey of college presidents revealed that most of them could agree that racism existed on campus, but they contended that racism was on other people's campuses and not their own. And similarly, a colleague of mine, Sean Harper, wrote an op-ed encouraging institutions to stop spending money to bring in consultants to tell them what they want to hear rather than the truth. And so, as Sean mentions, I, have often dealt with campus leaders who were unwilling to grapple with racial problems on campus for fear of tarnishing their institutional reputation or their personal image or some other nonsense-based rationale that would afford them restful sleep at night. But I think it's important to draw attention to Ruth Simmons, who was president at Brown University, as an example. So she was the first Black woman of an Ivy League school. And one of the things she did is commission an investigation into the institution's ties to slavery. And this was an unprecedented act, and it prompted other Ivy League institutions to follow suit. Now, this investigation, led to other institutions acknowledging histories that had been hidden and attempting to make amends, to be sure, attempting to make amends. And there is no denying that she was the first one to say, as an institution, we need to deal with our legacy of slavery. But it didn't need to be a Black woman to say that. Tons of others before her could have said that, but they didn't. And so As I come to the conclusion of my talk, there are a few things I want to explain. So we have to ask the question, if Black women are so magic, why aren't more people emulating what we do? I mean, if we are indeed magic. And the reality is that Black women's work is just that. And when we take a celebratory idea and turn it into a trope, we dismiss Black women's labor and sacrifices. And I think one could easily walk away from this talk thinking that the solution to our problems is to go out and hire a bunch of Black women. And that's not completely a bad idea in terms of increasing Black women's employment profile. However, my larger point is not about hiring Black women. My point is about looking to Black women as a frame for transforming oneself and the institutions we're a part of. So I think it would be unfair to expect us to do that work for you. If we're committed to changing institutions, we need different framing, and what I'm offering in this talk is just another way of framing the work and contributions to higher education. And while emulating what Black women have done and continue to do, the responsibility for all of us is to be cautious and not render Black women invisible in the process or to engage in co-optation of the work we already do. So I want to close with a quote from Michael Eric Dyson's book, Why I Love Black Women. He says, "I think it undeniable that we live in a society that has failed to acknowledge the full extent of our debt to Black women's gifts. We have often absorbed their wisdom, sucked their lives, appealed to their insight, depended on their strength, desired their beauty, fed on their hope, hungered for their affirmation, sought their approval, and relied on their faith. And yet we have not paid sufficient tribute to how central Black women are to our race, our nation, indeed our globe, as they have fought for freedom with their hearts, minds, and souls. Those of us who have benefited from Black women's love ought to love them back in the presence of the world." Thank you.